The ballroom went silent the moment Camille Ashworth said the word no. It was not a whisper. It was not a private refusal spoken behind closed doors. It was loud, sharp, and final, spoken in front of 40 guests, 3 servants, and a man who was not used to being refused anything. Duke Sebastian Blackwood stood in the middle of the Ashworth drawing room, his tall frame still, his face unreadable, while the woman he had traveled 2 days to meet took a step back from him as if he carried some kind of illness. "I will not marry a man who buries his feelings the way he buries his wives," Camille said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and defiance. A gasp moved through the room like a wave. Someone dropped a teacup. The clock on the mantel kept ticking, indifferent to the disaster unfolding beneath it. Sebastian did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His eyes, cold and gray like a winter sky, simply moved to Lord Edmund Ashworth, Camille's father, who stood frozen near the fireplace with the color draining from his face. "I was told," Sebastian said slowly, "that this arrangement was settled." "It was," Edmund stammered. "It is." Camille apologized to the Duke at once. But Camille was already stepping further away, her eyes wide with something close to panic. She had heard the stories. Everyone had heard the stories. The Duke of Blackwood, they said, had loved his first wife so briefly and lost her so suddenly that something in him had closed like a door that would never open again. They said he ran his estate like a military camp. They said he had not smiled in 3 years. Camille did not want to marry a ghost of a man. She wanted warmth. She wanted admiration. She had spent her whole life being told she was the beautiful one, the charming one, the daughter who would marry well and bring the family back into society's good graces. She was not going to spend that beauty on a man who looked at her like she was a line item in a business contract. "I am sorry, Your Grace," she said, though her tone carried no real apology in it, "but I cannot." She turned and walked out of the room, her skirt sweeping behind her, leaving her father standing in the wreckage of a marriage he desperately needed. Lord Edmund Ashworth was not simply embarrassed. He was ruined, or close enough to it. The estate's debts had grown quietly for years, hidden behind polished floors and rented furniture, and secrets he told no one, not even his wife. The alliance with the Duke of Blackwood was not about pride. It was about survival. Land disputes with a neighboring estate had threatened to strip away the last of the Ashworth holdings, and only a connection to a man as powerful as Sebastian Blackwood could settle the matter before the family lost everything. And now that connection had just walked out of the room in a huff of silk and refusal. Sebastian did not move for a long moment. His jaw tightened, the only sign that he felt anything at all. He had come here, expecting a simple transaction, a marriage of convenience, nothing more. He was not a man who wasted time on courtship or affection. He had learned, painfully, that affection was a luxury that could be taken from you in a single breath, on a single ordinary morning, without warning. He turned to leave. "Wait." The voice was quiet, but it carried. It came from the doorway, where a young woman stood with her hands folded in front of her plain gray dress. She was not dressed for a ball. She looked as though she had been pulled from the household ledgers, her hair simply pinned, her face calm in a way that felt strange next to the chaos around her. This was Eleanor Ashworth, the elder daughter, the one nobody in the room had thought to introduce. Eleanor had spent her whole life standing just outside the light that always seemed to fall on her younger sister. She was not unattractive, but she was not the kind of beauty that stopped conversations. She was clever, careful, and quiet, the kind of daughter who managed the household accounts while her mother fussed over Camille's gowns, the kind of daughter who was thanked for her usefulness but never celebrated for her presence. She had watched the entire scene from the doorway. She had watched her father's face crumble. She had watched her sister choose pride over duty. And something in her, some old and tired part of her that had spent years being invisible, decided that she was done standing quietly in corners. "Eleanor," her father said, startled. "This is not the time." "It is exactly the time," Eleanor said, stepping further into the room. Her voice did not shake. She had learned long ago that fear only made things worse, and that the only way through a hard moment was straight through the middle of it. Sebastian turned to look at her properly for the first time. He took in the plain dress, the steady eyes, the complete absence of the theatrical panic her sister had shown. She did not look away from him. Most people did. "You are her sister," he said. It was not a question. "I am," Eleanor said. "And I understand the arrangement was never truly about my sister. It was about land and debt and a solution that benefits us both." She glanced briefly at her father, then back at the Duke. "I am willing to be that solution, if you are willing to consider it." The room, if it were possible, grew even quieter. Lord Edmund's mouth opened and closed without sound. A footman near the wall stared at the floor, pretending not to listen. Somewhere in the hallway, Camille's rapid footsteps had stopped, as though she too had frozen to hear what would happen next. Sebastian studied Eleanor for a long moment. He was a man who read people the way other men read ledgers, searching for the truth beneath the surface, the crack in the polish. He looked for panic in her eyes and did not find it. He looked for desperation and found instead something steadier, something that looked almost like resolve. She was not what he had come for. She was not beautiful in the way society measured beauty, not dazzling, not soft-spoken in the practiced way young women were taught to be around powerful men, but she was standing in front of him without flinching, offering herself up not out of romance or foolish hope, but out of plain, practical necessity. He understood practical necessity. It was the only language he trusted anymore. "You would marry a stranger," he said, "to save your father's estate." "I would marry a stranger," Eleanor corrected gently, "to save my family from ruin, and to solve a problem that clearly needs solving before either of us leaves this room." There was no flattery in her words, no attempt to charm him. She spoke to him the way she might speak to a merchant negotiating a fair price, plainly and without apology. Something shifted behind the Duke's eyes, so small that no one else in the room noticed it. It was not warmth, not yet. It was something closer to recognition, the feeling of meeting someone who did not perform for him, who did not soften her words to please him. "Do you understand what you are offering?" he asked. "This will not be a marriage built on affection. I have little of that left to give." "I understand," Eleanor said quietly. "I am not asking for affection. I am asking for a fair arrangement, honestly made." For a moment nobody in the room breathed. Lord Edmund looked as though he might faint from relief and shame at the same time. Somewhere upstairs a door closed softly, and everyone understood it was Camille retreating to her room, safe from a decision she no longer had to make. Sebastian looked at Eleanor for a long time, longer than was polite, long enough that she felt the weight of his gaze settle over her like something physical. She did not lower her eyes. She had spent her whole life being overlooked, and if this man was going to look at her, truly look at her, she was not going to be the one to look away first. Finally he spoke. "She'll do." The words landed strangely in the room, cold and simple, not a proposal so much as a decision made and announced. There was no kneeling, no ring produced from a pocket, no soft words meant to make the moment feel like the beginning of a love story. It was, in every sense, a transaction, spoken the way a man might agree to purchase a piece of land after inspecting its soil. And yet, for Eleanor, standing there in her plain gray dress with her hands still folded in front of her, something inside her chest tightened with a feeling she did not have a name for. It was not joy. It was not romance. It was, strangely, the first time in her entire life that someone had chosen her, even if the choosing had nothing to do with love. Her mother appeared in the doorway moments later, drawn by the commotion, and when she understood what had happened, her face twisted with something between confusion and dismay. "Eleanor," she said, "surely this was meant for your sister." "It was," Eleanor said simply, "but Camille said no, and someone has to say yes." Her mother had no response to that. There was nothing to say. The matter, as far as the Duke was concerned, was already settled. Sebastian did not linger long after that. He gave brief, businesslike instructions about the drawing up of contracts, mentioned a date that felt impossibly close, and left the house with the same cold efficiency with which he had entered it. There were no lingering glances, no soft farewells. He simply turned and walked out to his waiting carriage, leaving behind a family in stunned silence, and a daughter, who suddenly found herself engaged to a man she had spoken to for less than 10 minutes. That night, Eleanor sat by her window long after the house had gone quiet, looking out over the dark gardens where she had spent so many years unseen. She thought of her sister's tears, muffled behind a closed door down the hall. She thought of her father's relief, and the way he had not quite met her eyes when he thanked her, as though he understood, on some level, the strange sacrifice she had just made. She thought, too, of the Duke's face, the stillness in it, the complete absence of anything soft. He had not looked at her the way men were supposed to look at the women they intended to marry. He had looked at her the way one looks at a solution to a problem, useful and necessary and nothing more. And yet, there had been a flicker, so brief she almost imagined it, when their eyes had held a moment too long. A flicker that felt, for just a second, like being seen. Eleanor did not know if she had imagined it. She did not know what kind of life waited for her behind the closed and guarded doors of Blackwood Manor, or what kind of man she had just agreed to spend her life beside. She only knew that for the first time since she could remember, someone had needed her, chosen her, even if only out of necessity. It was not love. It was not even close to it. But it was, she thought, as she finally closed her eyes that night, a beginning. And after years of being the forgotten daughter, a beginning, even a cold one, felt like more than she had ever dared to hope for. Outside, the wind moved through the bare branches of the garden trees, and somewhere far across the countryside, in a manor house shadowed by grief and silence, a man who had sworn never to let anyone close again sat alone in his study, staring at a marriage contract that bore a name he barely knew, wondering, despite himself, what kind of woman he had just agreed to bring into his broken home. The carriage rattled over the last stretch of road, and Eleanor pressed her hand flat against the cold glass of the window, watching Blackwood Manor rise out of the mist like something carved from stone rather than built by hands. It was larger than her family's estate by 3 times, its towers gray and severe against a sky heavy with clouds, its windows dark even in the middle of the afternoon. The wedding itself had taken place only 4 days earlier, and it had been, in every sense, a formality rather than a celebration. There had been no flowers chosen with care, no music that lingered in the memory, no moment where the groom lifted his bride's veil with trembling hands. There had been a priest, a signed contract, a small gathering of witnesses whose faces Eleanor could barely recall, and a duke who had said his vows in the same clipped, businesslike tone he used to discuss land boundaries. Camille had not attended. Her absence had been explained away with a vague illness that fooled no one, though Eleanor understood well enough that her sister could not bear to watch the marriage she had refused be claimed by someone else, even if that someone else was her own sister. Now, as the carriage came to a stop in front of the manor's towering entrance, Eleanor smoothed the front of her traveling dress and reminded herself, as she had done countless times over the past 4 days, that she had chosen this. No one had forced her hand. She had walked into this marriage with her eyes open, understanding exactly what kind of arrangement it was. That did not make the sight of her new home any less intimidating. The manor's great doors opened before she reached them, and a line of servants stood waiting in the entrance hall, their faces carefully blank in the way that spoke of long practice in hiding their true feelings. At the front of the line stood an older woman with silver hair pulled into a severe knot and sharp eyes that studied Eleanor with open assessment. "Your Grace," the woman said, offering a slight bow of her head, "I am Margaret Holloway, housekeeper of Blackwood Manor. Welcome home." The word home felt strange in Eleanor's ears, spoken about a place she had never seen until this very moment. "Thank you, Mrs. Holloway," Eleanor said, offering a small, genuine smile, the kind of warmth she had learned to give freely, even when she received little of it in return. "I am grateful for your welcome." Something shifted in the housekeeper's expression, surprise perhaps, or the beginning of curiosity. It seemed the staff of Blackwood Manor were not accustomed to being thanked. Sebastian was not among those waiting to receive her. Eleanor noted his absence but said nothing, following Mrs. Holloway through halls lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors and rooms so large and cold that her footsteps echoed against the polished floors. The manor was beautiful in the way that abandoned things are sometimes beautiful, elegant and untouched, as though life had simply stopped moving through its halls some years before. She found Sebastian eventually, or rather, she was led to him, in a study at the end of a long corridor, where he sat behind a heavy oak desk surrounded by papers and ledgers stacked in careful towers. He did not rise when she entered. He barely looked up. "You arrived safely," he said, more observation than greeting. "I did," Eleanor said, stepping into the room. She let her eyes move over the space, noting the account books, the correspondence, the general air of a man who buried himself in work rather than face whatever waited for him outside his study door. "This is a large household to manage." "It is managed well enough," Sebastian said. "I did not say otherwise." Eleanor kept her voice even. "I simply observed that it is large." He looked up at that, something flickering across his face, an emotion too brief to name. Perhaps he had expected complaints, or nervous chatter, or the kind of anxious questions new brides were supposed to ask about their place in an unfamiliar household. He had not expected calm observation. "Mrs. Holloway will show you to your rooms," he said finally. "You may make whatever arrangements you find necessary regarding the household. I trust you will not require my involvement in such matters." It was, Eleanor understood, both a permission and a dismissal. She was being handed the running of an entire estate, with the same indifference one might use to hand over an umbrella on a rainy day. "I understand," she said. "And dinner? I take my meals here, in the study, more often than not." Eleanor considered this for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Very well. I will have a tray sent up then, unless you would prefer to dine in the hall." "The study will suffice." There was nothing cruel in his tone, No deliberate coldness meant to wound her. It was simply the way he spoke, flat and efficient. A man who had long ago stopped expecting conversation to lead anywhere pleasant. Eleanor left the study without pressing further, understanding instinctively that this was not a man who could be softened through argument or insistence. If anything was going to change between them, it would happen slowly, through patience rather than persuasion. The weeks that followed settled into a quiet, careful rhythm. Eleanor threw herself into the running of the household with the same discipline she had once used to manage her father's crumbling finances, only now she had resources to work with rather than debts to hide. She reviewed the estate's accounts in the evenings, noticing discrepancies here and there that she filed away to investigate later. She spoke with the staff, learning their names, their histories, the small details of their lives that most nobility never bothered to ask about. She walked the gardens, overgrown and neglected, and began making quiet plans for their restoration. Sebastian, for his part, remained mostly a distant presence in his own home. He left early for meetings with tenants and stewards, returned late, and spent his evenings buried in paperwork behind a closed study door. Eleanor rarely saw him for more than a few minutes at a time, and when she did, their conversations remained brief and practical. Discussions of household expenses or upcoming social obligations, neither of them particularly wanted to attend. And yet, slowly, almost imperceptibly, something began to shift. It started with small things. Eleanor noticed that the household ledgers, when she finally gained full access to them, revealed a pattern of overspending in certain areas that did not match the careful frugality evident everywhere else in the manor. She began quietly cross-referencing invoices, comparing them against deliveries, and found herself staying up later than she intended, candle burning low, columns of numbers swimming before her tired eyes. One evening, Sebastian found her still awake in the study he considered his own, papers spread across the desk, her brow furrowed in concentration. "You are still awake," he observed, standing in the doorway with the particular stillness that seemed to define him. "I am," Eleanor said, not looking up immediately. "I believe there is an issue with the tenant accounts. Several entries do not match the deliveries recorded in the stable ledger." Something in his posture changed, a subtle straightening, the attention of a man who took his finances seriously suddenly fully engaged. "Show me." For the next hour they sat together at the desk, heads bent over the same pages, and Eleanor found herself explaining her reasoning, while Sebastian listened, truly listened, asking sharp questions that showed he was following her logic rather than simply humoring her. It was the longest conversation they had shared since their wedding day, and neither of them mentioned love, or affection, or any of the softer things a marriage was supposed to contain. They spoke only of numbers, and discrepancies, and the slow unraveling of a mystery neither of them had expected to find. "You have a sharp mind," Sebastian said finally, leaning back in his chair, studying her with an expression she could not quite read. "I did not expect that." "Because I am plain and quiet?" Eleanor asked, though there was no bitterness in the question, only genuine curiosity about what he had truly expected of her. "Because most people I have known," Sebastian said slowly, "care more about appearing clever than actually being useful." It was not a compliment in the traditional sense, not the kind of flattering words a suitor might whisper to charm a lady's heart. But Eleanor felt the weight of it all the same, understood that from a man like Sebastian Blackwood, such an observation was as close to praise as she was likely to receive, and she found, to her own surprise, that it settled warmly in her chest. Life at the manor was not without its difficulties. The staff, though respectful, remained cautious around her for weeks, as though testing whether her kindness was genuine or simply a performance that would fade once she felt secure in her position. Eleanor understood their hesitation. She had grown up watching her own mother's affections shift depending on which daughter currently held favor, and she recognized the particular wariness of people who had learned not to trust easily. She earned their trust slowly, through consistency rather than grand gestures. She remembered the names of the younger housemaids. She asked after a groundskeeper's ailing mother and quietly arranged for a physician to visit. She never raised her voice, never demanded, never made anyone feel smaller for the sake of feeling larger herself. It was this quality, more than anything else, that began to catch Sebastian's attention, though he would not have admitted it even to himself. One afternoon, returning from a meeting with a difficult tenant, he found Eleanor in the small sitting room adjacent to the kitchens, her arm around a young housemaid named Alice, who was crying softly into a handkerchief. Eleanor's voice was low and steady, offering comfort without pity, the kind of comfort that came from genuine understanding rather than obligation. "Her brother," Eleanor explained quietly, when Sebastian lingered in the doorway, unnoticed at first by the grieving girl. He was injured in an accident on a neighboring farm. She has been waiting for news all week. Sebastian said nothing, but he did not leave immediately either. He watched as Eleanor continued speaking softly to the girl, offering practical comfort, arranging for someone to check on the family, promising that whatever was needed would be provided. There was no performance in it, no awareness that she was being watched. It was simply who she was when she believed herself unobserved. Something in his chest tightened, unfamiliar and uncomfortable. It had been a long time since he had witnessed genuine tenderness in his own home, a long time since anyone had moved through these cold halls as though warmth were simply a natural extension of their character rather than a rare and calculated gift. He thought, unwillingly, of his first wife, whose gentleness had been fragile, easily overwhelmed, requiring careful protection that he had ultimately failed to provide. Eleanor's gentleness was different. It did not ask to be protected. It stood on its own, steady and unshaken, even in the face of another person's pain. He turned and walked away before either woman noticed him, retreating to his study with a strange, unsettled feeling he could not name, one that followed him long into the night, keeping sleep at bay far longer than any ledger discrepancy ever had. Eleanor, unaware of the moment she had been observed, continued her quiet work of turning a cold and silent house into something that, however slowly, was beginning to breathe again. She did not know if the Duke noticed the small changes taking root around him, the fresh flowers she had begun placing in the hallways, the warmer light of candles left burning a little longer in shared spaces, the gradual softening of a staff that had once moved through the manor like shadows, and now occasionally smiled when they thought no one important was watching. She did not expect gratitude, and she certainly did not expect affection. She had entered this marriage with clear eyes and modest hopes, understanding it as a practical arrangement between two people who needed something from each other. But as the weeks passed, she found herself, almost against her own will, hoping for something more than practicality, though she could not yet name what that something might be. Late one evening, as she prepared for bed in the quiet of her chambers, she caught her own reflection in the mirror and studied it for a long moment. This woman who had once believed herself unwanted, standing now as mistress of a great house, slowly, carefully, without any dramatic declaration, beginning to matter to the people around her. It was not love. She reminded herself of that fact often, as though repetition might protect her from disappointment. But it was, perhaps, the beginning of being seen, and for a woman who had spent her whole life standing in her sister's shadow, that beginning felt like more than she had ever dared to hope for. Down the hall, in his study, Sebastian sat staring at a ledger he was no longer reading, his mind occupied instead by the image of a woman's steady voice offering comfort to a grieving girl, and the uncomfortable, unfamiliar realization that his cold and practical marriage might be turning into something he had never intended, and was not entirely certain he knew how to stop. 3 months into her marriage, Eleanor found the locked door. It was tucked away at the end of the manor's east wing, a narrow passage rarely used by the household staff, and she might never have noticed it at all had she not been searching for a missing crate of linens that Mrs. Holloway insisted had been stored somewhere in that direction. The door itself was unremarkable, painted the same pale gray as the walls around it, but something about the way the housemaid accompanying her hesitated before it made Eleanor pause. "What room is this?" she asked. The young maid, a girl named Priscilla who had only worked at the manor for 2 years, shifted uncomfortably. "It is locked, Your Grace. Has been since before my time here. Mrs. Holloway says it is not to be opened." Eleanor's curiosity, always a quiet but persistent part of her nature, settled over the door like a held breath. She did not try the handle. She simply noted its location and continued her search for the missing linens, though the memory of that locked door lingered in her mind for days afterward. She learned the truth of it, eventually, not through direct inquiry, which she suspected would only meet with silence, but through careful, patient conversation with Mrs. Holloway over the course of several evenings, the kind of conversation built slowly through trust, rather than demanded through authority. "It was to be the nursery," Mrs. Holloway said finally, one evening as they sat together reviewing linen inventories, her voice quieter than usual. "For the child the late Duchess was carrying when she passed. His Grace had it prepared before anyone knew anything was wrong. Cradle, curtains, everything a mother could want for her child. And then, in a single night, both were gone. A fever, sudden and merciless. There was nothing anyone could do." Eleanor set down her pen, the weight of the story settling over her like a heavy blanket. "And no one has entered since." "No one," Mrs. Holloway confirmed. "His Grace ordered it locked a week after the funeral, and it has remained so ever since. I do not believe he has opened that door in 3 years, Your Grace, and I would advise you, gently, not to raise the matter with him." Eleanor But Eleanor, though she respected the warning, found herself unable to let the matter rest entirely. Grief, she understood, was not something that healed through avoidance. She had watched her own father bury his troubles behind closed study doors for years, pretending that ignoring a problem might somehow make it disappear. And she had seen how that avoidance had nearly destroyed their family. She did not believe locking away grief made it lighter. She believed it only made the weight of it grow heavier over time, pressing down on a person until they could barely stand beneath it. She thought of Sebastian differently after learning the truth of that locked room. His coldness, which had once seemed simply a matter of temperament, now revealed itself as something closer to a wound, carefully bandaged but never properly healed. She began to notice small things she had previously overlooked, the way his eyes sometimes lingered too long on children playing in the village square when they passed through on errands, the way he avoided the eastern wing of the house entirely, taking longer routes through the manor simply to avoid walking past that single locked door. It was around this same time that Camille reappeared in their lives. The letter arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning, addressed to Eleanor in her sister's familiar looping handwriting, filled with warm words about missing her dear sister and hoping to visit soon now that the family had settled from the shock of recent events. Eleanor read the letter twice, searching for sincerity beneath the flowery language, and found instead something that felt more like calculation than genuine affection. She was not entirely surprised then, when Camille arrived at Blackwood Manor 2 weeks later, unannounced, her carriage pulling up the drive with the same dramatic timing that had always characterized her sister's entrances into any room. "Eleanor," Camille exclaimed, sweeping into the entrance hall with her arms outstretched, as though the awkward and painful circumstances of their last meeting had never occurred. "You look wonderful. Marriage clearly agrees with you." Eleanor accepted her sister's embrace with careful reserve, aware of Mrs. Holloway watching from a discreet distance, aware too of the way the household staff seemed to stiffen slightly at Camille's arrival, as though sensing something unsettled beneath her bright smile. "Camille," Eleanor said, "I was not expecting you." "I could not stay away any longer," Camille said, her eyes already sweeping the grand entrance hall with obvious appreciation, taking in the high ceilings, the polished floors, the general grandeur of a home far finer than the one they had grown up in. "I have missed you terribly, and I simply had to see how you were settling in." Eleanor understood, with the particular clarity that came from years of watching her sister navigate the world, that this visit had little to do with sisterly affection, and a great deal to do with Camille's growing awareness of exactly what she had refused when she rejected the Duke's proposal. Word had spread through their social circles of the Duke's rising influence, a recent honor bestowed upon him by matters of state, an expansion of his holdings that had made him, if possible, even more desirable a match than before. Camille, Eleanor suspected, had come not to celebrate her sister's happiness, but to reassess a decision she now regretted. Her suspicions were confirmed within the hour, when Sebastian returned from his morning rounds of the estate and found Camille seated in the drawing room, positioned with careful elegance near the window where the afternoon light fell most flattering upon her features. "Your Grace," Camille said, rising with a graceful curtsy, her smile warm in a way it had never been during their first disastrous meeting. "How wonderful to see you again. I must apologize for my behavior when we first met. I was young and foolish, and I did not understand then what a remarkable man you truly are." Eleanor watched from the doorway as Sebastian's expression remained carefully neutral, though she noted the slight tightening around his eyes, the particular stillness that seemed to overtake him whenever he found himself in a situation he had not anticipated. "Lady Camille," he said, with cool politeness, "I trust you are well." "Very well, thank you," Camille said, her eyes lingering on him a moment longer than propriety strictly allowed, "though I confess, I have thought often of our first meeting, and how differently things might have unfolded had I possessed better judgment at the time." The implication in her words hung heavy in the air, and Eleanor felt something cold settle in her stomach. Not jealousy exactly, but a familiar, aching awareness of her old position in the family hierarchy, the sister who was chosen only after the preferred choice had been made, and who might just as easily be discarded should that preferred choice change her mind. She said nothing, however, choosing instead to offer her sister the same careful hospitality she would extend to any guest, arranging for tea, ensuring Camille's rooms were properly prepared for what promised to be an extended stay. She would not give her sister the satisfaction of visible distress, would not confirm whatever doubts Camille might be hoping to plant. But the days that followed tested her resolve in ways she had not anticipated. Camille was, if nothing else, skilled in the particular art of subtle intrusion. She found excuses to seek out Sebastian during his rare moments of leisure, asking his opinion on matters she could easily have asked Eleanor, laughing a little too readily at observations that were only mildly amusing, positioning herself in rooms and at times where their paths would naturally cross. She was careful never to cross any obvious line of impropriety, but the accumulated weight of her attention created a persistent, uncomfortable pressure that Eleanor felt in every quiet corner of her own home. Sebastian, to his credit, remained largely unmoved by these efforts, responding to Camille's overtures with the same polite distance he extended to most social interactions. But Eleanor could not entirely dismiss the small, persistent voice of doubt that Camille's presence stirred within her. The old, familiar fear that she was simply a placeholder, a temporary solution that would be swept aside the moment something better presented itself. It was during this uneasy period that Eleanor found herself once again standing before the locked door in the east wing, drawn there by some instinct she could not fully explain, perhaps a need to understand more fully the man she had married, or perhaps simply a desire to escape the tension that had settled over the manor since her sister's arrival. She was standing there, one hand resting lightly against the cool wood of the door, when Sebastian's voice startled her from behind. "You should not be here." Eleanor turned to find him standing at the end of the corridor, his face pale in the dim light, his usual composure visibly shaken. "I am sorry," she said quietly. "I did not mean to intrude. This room is not to be opened," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "I know," Eleanor said. "Mrs. Holloway told me why." Something flashed across his face, anger perhaps, or simply the raw exposure of a wound long hidden suddenly brought into the light. "Then you understand why I would prefer you did not linger here." Eleanor did not retreat, though every instinct told her that retreat would be the safer, easier choice. Instead, she stepped closer, her voice gentle but steady. "Sebastian, grief that is locked away does not disappear. It only grows heavier the longer it is carried alone. You know nothing of what I carry," he said, his voice sharper than she had ever heard it, though beneath the sharpness, she detected something closer to pain than anger. "I know that you have not smiled in the months I have lived in this house," Eleanor said quietly. "I know that you avoid this entire wing of your own home. I know that you have built walls so high around yourself that even the servants who love you are afraid to speak your late wife's name in your presence." "Because there is nothing to be gained from speaking of what cannot be changed," Sebastian said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier sharpness, replaced now by something closer to exhaustion. "Perhaps not," Eleanor agreed. "But there is something to be gained from not carrying it entirely alone." He said nothing for a long moment, and Eleanor thought perhaps she had pushed too far, had trespassed into territory he was not yet ready to share with anyone, least of all a wife he had married out of necessity rather than affection. But then, slowly, he moved closer, until he too stood before the locked door, his hand hovering near the handle without quite touching it. "Her name was Margaret," he said finally, so quietly that Eleanor had to strain to hear him. "We were married for 2 years before she conceived. She was so happy, so certain everything would finally be right in our lives." His voice caught, and he paused, gathering himself before continuing. "The fever took her in a single night. By morning, both she and the child we had waited so long for were gone, and I was left standing in a house full of preparations for a life that would never begin." Eleanor said nothing, understanding instinctively that this was not a moment that called for words, but simply for presence, for the quiet acknowledgement that his pain was being witnessed rather than dismissed. "I locked this door because I could not bear to see what waited inside," Sebastian continued. "The cradle, the tiny clothes she had sewn herself. I told myself I would return to it eventually, when the grief had faded enough to bear it. But it never faded. It simply became something I learned to carry silently, day after day, until silence became the only way I knew how to live." "You do not have to carry it silently any longer," Eleanor said softly. He turned to look at her then, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. "Why does it matter to you? This was never part of our arrangement." "Because," Eleanor said, choosing her words with careful honesty, "I have spent my whole life being the person no one thought to ask about, the daughter whose feelings mattered less because someone else's mattered more. I understand what it is to carry pain silently, because you believe no one is interested in hearing it. I do not wish that same silence upon you, even if our marriage began as nothing more than a practical arrangement." Something shifted in his expression, the careful walls he maintained cracking, just slightly, just enough for her to glimpse the exhausted, grieving man beneath the cold exterior he presented to the world. "I do not know how to be anything other than what I have become," he admitted, his voice rough with an emotion he seemed almost ashamed to reveal. "You do not have to know. Eleanor said gently. You simply have to be willing to try. That is all any of us can do. They stood together in silence for a long moment, the locked door between them and the room full of grief it protected, until finally Sebastian reached out and covered her hand with his own. A small gesture, simple and unpolished, but one that carried more weight than any grand declaration could have managed. Thank you, he said quietly, for not pretending this does not exist, for not asking me to be someone I am not. I would never ask that of you, Eleanor said. I only ask that you allow yourself to heal, in whatever time that requires. He did not open the door that day. Eleanor did not expect him to, understanding that healing rarely arrived in single, dramatic moments, but rather through a slow accumulation of smaller courage, gathered over time. But something had shifted between them in that quiet corridor, some barrier lowered, however slightly, and Eleanor felt it in the days that followed, in the way Sebastian's eyes lingered on her a moment longer during their brief evening conversations, in the way his voice softened, almost imperceptibly, whenever he addressed her directly. Camille, watching these subtle changes with the sharp attention of a woman accustomed to reading social dynamics, grew increasingly frustrated by her inability to capture the Duke's interest in the way she had once assumed she easily could. Her overtures, once so effortlessly successful with other suitors, seemed to bounce off Sebastian's careful reserve without leaving any visible mark, while Eleanor, plain and quiet Eleanor, seemed to be earning something Camille could not name but recognized instinctively as far more valuable than mere attraction. It was this growing frustration, simmering beneath Camille's polished exterior, that would eventually curdle into something far more dangerous than simple jealousy, though neither Eleanor nor Sebastian yet understood the storm that was quietly gathering beneath the surface of their fragile, newly forming trust. For now, though, in the quiet weeks that followed their conversation before the locked door, Eleanor allowed herself, cautiously, to hope. She watched as Sebastian began taking his evening meals in the main dining hall, rather than hiding away in his study. She noticed the way he began asking after her day, small questions at first, tentative and unpracticed, but genuine in their curiosity. She felt, for the first time since arriving at Blackwood Manor, that she was not simply managing a household, but slowly, carefully, building something that might one day resemble a true partnership, built not on the foundation of grand romantic gestures, but on the steadier, more enduring foundation of honesty, patience, and the shared willingness to see another person's pain without flinching away from it. She did not yet know how fragile that foundation would prove to be, or how quickly her sister's quiet resentment would find its opportunity to strike. The rumor began, as most damaging rumors do, with a grain of truth twisted just enough to become something unrecognizable. It started in the drawing rooms of the wider county, whispered between women over afternoon tea, passed along in letters written with careful, deniable phrasing. The story suggested that Eleanor Ashworth, plain and overlooked for most of her life, had seen an opportunity in the Duke's grief, and moved quickly to secure it before he could think clearly enough to choose otherwise. It suggested that she had known of his fragile emotional state following his sister's public refusal, and had positioned herself deliberately to take advantage of a moment of weakness, securing for herself a title, a fortune, and a position she never could have earned through any means other than calculated manipulation. Eleanor first heard the whispers from Mrs. Holloway, who arrived in her sitting room one afternoon with an expression of barely contained distress, a folded letter clutched in her hand. "Your Grace," the housekeeper said, "I did not wish to trouble you with this, but I fear it has already begun to spread, and I believe you should hear it from someone who cares for you rather than discover it through cruel gossip." Eleanor read the letter, forwarded from a cousin in the county who had thought it only fair to warn the family of what was being said, and felt something cold and familiar settle in her chest. The old, aching sensation of being seen as less than she was, of having her true character twisted into something ugly, by people who had never bothered to know her at all. Who would spread such a thing? She asked, though even as she spoke the words, a suspicion was already forming in her mind, one she desperately hoped was wrong. She did not have to wait long to confirm her fears. That very evening she overheard a conversation between Camille and a visiting acquaintance in the manor's garden, their voices carrying through an open window on the evening breeze. "Of course I would never say such things myself," Camille was saying, her voice carrying the particular tone of someone who wished to appear reluctant while thoroughly enjoying the telling. "But it is rather convenient, is it not, how quickly Eleanor stepped forward that day? She has always been the practical sort. I suppose she saw her chance and took it, though I would never have imagined my own sister capable of such calculation." Eleanor stood frozen at the window, her hand pressed against her chest as though she might physically hold together the pieces of herself that felt suddenly, violently fractured. She had known her sister to be vain, sometimes thoughtless, occasionally cruel in the careless way of someone who had never had to consider the feelings of others too carefully. But this deliberate planting of doubt, this willingness to sacrifice her own sister's reputation for the sake of reopening a door she herself had once slammed shut, felt like a betrayal deeper than anything Eleanor had previously experienced. She did not confront Camille that night. She was not certain, in that moment, that she trusted her own voice not to break. Instead, she retreated to her chambers and sat alone in the darkness, turning over the painful, familiar question that had haunted her since childhood. Why was it always so easy for people to believe the worst of her, and so difficult for them to simply trust that her kindness was genuine? The rumors reached Sebastian 3 days later, delivered by a steward named Henry Colton, who had managed the estate's finances for over a decade and had long enjoyed the Duke's trust. Eleanor had, in fact, already discovered troubling discrepancies in Henry's own record-keeping during her careful review of the household accounts, discrepancies that suggested the steward had been quietly redirecting funds meant for tenant repairs into his own accounts over a period of several years. She had not yet brought this evidence to Sebastian, wanting to be entirely certain of her findings before making such a serious accusation. Henry, perhaps sensing that his deception was close to being uncovered, saw in the spreading rumors a convenient opportunity to discredit the woman who threatened to expose him. "Your Grace," Henry said, finding Sebastian alone in his study on a gray afternoon, "I do not wish to speak out of turn, but I feel it is my duty to inform you of certain rumors circulating regarding the circumstances of your marriage." Sebastian's expression darkened immediately. "Speak plainly, or do not speak at all." "There are those who suggest," Henry continued carefully, "that the Duchess acted with considerable calculation on the day of your first meeting with her family, that she recognized an opportunity in your vulnerable state and moved to secure it for herself, understanding that a grieving man might be easily persuaded into an arrangement that served her interests rather than his own." Sebastian's hands, resting on the surface of his desk, curled slowly into fists. Old wounds he had believed at least partially healed through the quiet, patient trust he had begun building with Eleanor, tore open with sudden, brutal force. He thought of his first marriage, of how completely he had trusted, how thoroughly he had opened himself to love, only to have that trust rewarded with devastating, unbearable loss. He thought of the careful walls he had built afterward, walls that Eleanor had somehow, slowly, without his full awareness, begun to dismantle. Had it all been calculation on her part? Had her patience, her kindness, her willingness to sit with him before that locked door and speak gently of grief, all been simply a strategy to secure her position more firmly? He told himself the accusation was absurd even as some older, more wounded part of himself latched onto it desperately, grateful for any excuse to retreat back into the safety of emotional distance, rather than risk the terrifying vulnerability of trusting someone fully again. That evening he confronted Eleanor in the drawing room, his voice colder than it had been in months. The careful warmth that had begun to grow between them replaced entirely by the harsh, guarded tone she remembered from their very first meeting. "I have heard troubling things," he said, without preamble. Eleanor set down the book she had been reading, her heart already sinking at the coldness in his eyes. "I have heard them as well." "Is it true?" he demanded. "Did you see my grief as an opportunity? Did you calculate in that moment exactly how vulnerable I was, and move to take advantage of it?" The accusation struck Eleanor like a physical blow, all the more painful for coming from the one person she had begun, cautiously, to trust with the truest parts of herself. "You cannot believe that," she said, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain steady. "Can I not?" Sebastian's voice was sharp, defensive, the voice of a man protecting himself against a wound he could not survive a second time. "I have been deceived before, Eleanor. I trusted completely once, and it cost me everything. Forgive me if I find myself questioning whether I have simply allowed it to happen again." "I did not marry you for calculation," Eleanor said, her own voice rising now, wounded and angry in equal measure. "I married you because my father's estate faced ruin, and because my sister, your original choice, humiliated you, and abandoned the arrangement entirely. I offered myself because someone needed to, not because I saw some grand opportunity in your grief. And yet you have benefited considerably from that offer," Sebastian said coldly. "A title, a fortune, a position far beyond anything you could have expected as the overlooked daughter of a struggling estate." The words landed with devastating precision, striking directly at the deepest insecurity Eleanor carried, the fear that had haunted her since childhood, the fear that she was valued only for what she could provide, never for who she simply was. Tears gathered in her eyes, though she fought fiercely against letting them fall, unwilling to give him the satisfaction of watching her break beneath accusations she did not deserve. "If that is truly what you believe," she said, her voice quiet now, stripped of the anger that had briefly animated it, replaced instead by a weary, aching sadness, "then perhaps there is nothing more to say." She left the room before he could respond, retreating to her chambers where she finally allowed the tears to fall, silent and bitter, the culmination of months of careful hope crumbling beneath the weight of a single, devastating accusation. She thought of every moment she had believed herself finally, truly seen, the quiet conversation over the ledgers, the tenderness he had witnessed her offer to a grieving housemaid, the fragile trust built slowly before a locked door full of grief. All of it apparently meant nothing against the power of a rumor spoken by people who had never bothered to know her true character. She began, that very night, quietly preparing for her departure. It was not a decision made in anger, though anger certainly colored the edges of her heart. It was, rather, a decision born from the same weary resignation that had defined so much of her childhood, the understanding that when someone believed the worst of you despite every effort you had made to prove otherwise, there was little point in continuing to fight for a place you were never truly given. She packed only what she had brought with her, refusing to take anything that belonged to the Blackwood estate, understanding, with painful clarity, exactly how such an act might be interpreted given the current rumors surrounding her character. She wrote a brief letter to Sebastian, explaining her intention to return to her family home, careful to keep the tone professional, rather than emotional, unwilling to reveal the full extent of the heartbreak she carried. What Sebastian did not know, and what Eleanor had never mentioned to anyone within the household, was the true nature of her financial contribution to their marriage. Rather than benefiting from a generous dowry paid into her own accounts, Eleanor had quietly arranged, before the wedding, for the majority of her dowry to be directed instead toward settling her father's most pressing debts, ensuring that her family's estate would survive regardless of what became of her own marriage. She had told no one of this arrangement, wanting no credit for a decision she had made simply because it was right, not because she wished to be praised for her selflessness. Nor did Sebastian know of the careful investigation she had been conducting into Henry Colton's handling of the estate's finances, an investigation that, had it been completed and shared, would have revealed the steward's own guilt and, quite possibly, his motivation for spreading rumors designed to discredit her before she could expose him. These truths sat locked away in Eleanor's private papers, waiting to be discovered, as she prepared to leave behind a marriage that had, for a brief and precious time, felt like it might become something real. The morning of her departure arrived gray and overcast, fitting weather for the quiet, heartbroken retreat she had planned. She said her goodbyes to the household staff with careful composure, thanking Mrs. Holloway for her kindness, embracing young Alice, who cried openly at the news of her mistress's departure, offering quiet words of encouragement to the gardeners and stable hands who had come to genuinely respect the woman who had transformed their cold, silent household into something warmer during her brief time among them. Sebastian, she had been informed, was away on estate business and would not return until the following day. Eleanor was grateful for this small mercy, uncertain she possessed the strength to face him again after the devastating words exchanged between them. As her carriage prepared to depart, however, fate intervened in a manner neither of them could have anticipated. Mrs. Holloway, in the process of organizing Eleanor's remaining correspondence to be forwarded to her family home, discovered among the papers a detailed ledger documenting Eleanor's careful investigation into Henry Colton's financial misconduct, alongside a private letter, never sent, addressed to her father, in which Eleanor explained her decision to direct her dowry toward settling his debts rather than keeping it for herself. Understanding immediately the significance of what she had found, Mrs. Holloway made a decision that would change the course of everything that followed. She sent an urgent rider to intercept the Duke on his return journey, carrying both documents and a message urging him to return to the manor immediately, before it was too late to correct a terrible mistake. Sebastian read the letter twice while his horse thundered down the county road, the words blurring slightly as the animal's hooves pounded against packed earth, his heart hammering with a mixture of dawning horror and desperate hope. The ledger detailing Henry Colton's years of quiet theft was damning, precise, methodical in the way only Eleanor's careful mind could produce, cross-referencing invoices and deliveries with meticulous attention that left no room for doubt. But it was the second document, the unsent letter to her father, that struck him with the force of a physical blow. She had given away her own dowry, not spent it on herself, not hidden it away for her own security, but directed the entirety of it toward saving a family that had spent her whole life overlooking her in favor of a sister who had ultimately abandoned them all in a moment of crisis. She had done this quietly, without seeking recognition, without ever once using it as leverage in their marriage, without so much as mentioning it during the devastating confrontation in which he had accused her of calculated greed. He thought of Henry Colton's carefully timed rumors, delivered just as Eleanor's investigation into his misconduct was nearing completion, and understood with sickening clarity exactly how thoroughly he had been manipulated, and exactly how deeply he had wronged the one person who had shown him nothing but honest, patient kindness since the day they had married. He urged his horse faster, the manor's towers finally coming into view through the gray morning mist, praying with an intensity he had not felt in years that he was not already too late. Eleanor's carriage was still in the drive when he arrived, though the coachman had already begun loading the final pieces of luggage, and Eleanor herself stood near the entrance, speaking quiet final words to Mrs. Holloway, her composure carefully maintained despite the visible redness around her eyes that spoke of a sleepless, tearful night. "Eleanor." His voice carried across the drive with a rawness she had never heard from him before, stripped entirely of the cold composure that had defined nearly every interaction between them since their wedding day. She turned, startled, watching as he dismounted his horse with none of his usual careful control, closing the distance between them with long, urgent strides. "You should not be here," she said, echoing, without quite meaning to, the words he had once spoken to her before the locked door in the east wing. "I am leaving, Sebastian. I believe that is what you wished. I was wrong." The words came out rough, unpolished, nothing like the careful, measured speech she had grown accustomed to from him. "I was wrong about everything, and I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, but I am asking regardless, because the alternative is losing you, and I find that I cannot bear that possibility." Eleanor stood frozen, uncertain whether to trust the desperate sincerity in his voice or to protect herself from further heartbreak by maintaining the careful distance she had spent the previous night constructing around her wounded heart. "Mrs. Holloway found your ledger," Sebastian continued, pulling the papers from inside his coat, his hands visibly trembling, "and your letter to your father. Eleanor, you gave away everything, your dowry, your security, all of it, to save a family who has spent your whole life treating you as though you mattered less than everyone else around you. And I repaid that generosity by accusing you of the exact opposite, of calculation and greed, because I was too frightened to trust that someone could care for me without some hidden motive beneath their kindness." Eleanor felt tears gathering again, though these carried a different quality than the bitter, heartbroken tears of the previous night. "I did not do it for recognition," she said quietly. "I did not want you to know, because I did not want it used as some kind of proof of my worth. I wanted you to trust me because you knew me, not because you had evidence of my good character. I know that now," Sebastian said, "and I am ashamed that it took discovering these papers for me to see clearly what I should have trusted from the beginning. You have shown me nothing but honesty and patience since the day you stood in your family's drawing room and offered yourself as a solution to a crisis that was never your making. I let old fears, old wounds that had nothing to do with you, poison the trust we had begun building together, and I am sorrier for that than I know how to properly express." Around them, the household staff had begun gathering quietly at windows and doorways, drawn by the unusual sight of their reserved Duke standing exposed and vulnerable in the middle of the drive, his careful composure entirely abandoned in favor of raw, unguarded honesty. "There is more," Sebastian continued, his voice steadying slightly as he gathered his courage. "Henry Colton has been stealing from this estate for years, and when he realized you were close to uncovering his deception, he manufactured those rumors specifically to discredit you, before you could expose him. I have already sent for the magistrate. He will face proper consequences for both his theft and his lies." Eleanor absorbed this information slowly, understanding at last the source of the cruel rumors that had so nearly destroyed everything she had carefully built. "And Camille?" she asked quietly. "She spread those rumors as eagerly as anyone." Sebastian's expression darkened slightly. "Your sister's role in spreading unfounded gossip about her own sister's character is not something I intend to overlook, but that is a matter for your family to address, not mine to resolve on your behalf. What I can address, what I intend to address, is my own failure to trust you when trust was exactly what you deserved." He stepped closer, close enough that Eleanor could see the genuine anguish in his eyes, the desperate hope warring with the fear of rejection. "I am asking you not to leave, Eleanor. Not because our arrangement requires it, not because it would be practical or convenient, but because I have realized, far too late perhaps, that I do not simply need a wife to manage my household. I need you, your honesty, your patience, your quiet strength that has slowly, without my full awareness, become the foundation this house has been missing for years." Eleanor's carefully maintained composure finally broke, tears spilling freely down her cheeks as months of careful hope, devastating heartbreak, and desperate longing collided within her chest. "You accused me of the very worst things a person could believe about me," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I have spent my entire life being told, in ways large and small, that I mattered less than the people around me, that I was useful but never truly wanted. When you spoke those words to me, it confirmed every fear I have carried since childhood." "I know," Sebastian said, his own voice breaking slightly, "and I cannot undo the pain those words caused you. But I can promise you this, Eleanor. I choose you, not out of necessity, not because circumstances forced my hand, but because I have watched you transform this house, and more importantly, transform me, from the moment you walked through those doors as my wife. I was a man who believed himself incapable of trusting or loving again, and you proved me wrong through nothing more than patient, honest kindness. I do not wish to lose that. I do not wish to lose you." The staff gathered around them remained utterly silent, witnessing a moment that felt too significant, too raw, to interrupt with even the smallest sound. Eleanor searched his face for a long moment, looking past the desperate words to the genuine vulnerability beneath them, the same vulnerability she had first glimpsed before the locked nursery door, when he had finally allowed himself to speak of grief he had carried alone for years. "I do not want to spend my life being chosen only after every other option has been exhausted," she said finally, her voice steady despite the tears still marking her face. "I have spent enough of my life in that position. If I am to stay, Sebastian, I need to know that you choose me fully, openly, not as a fallback or a convenient solution, but as someone whose presence in your life you genuinely value." "I do choose you," Sebastian said, without hesitation, his voice carrying a certainty she had never heard from him before. "Fully, openly, and for the rest of whatever years I am fortunate enough to be given. I will not ask you to simply trust my words. I intend to prove it, through action, through patience, for as long as it takes for you to believe it fully." He reached out, gently, giving her every opportunity to step away if she chose, and when she did not, he took her hand in both of his own, holding it as though it were something precious and fragile, something he had nearly lost through his own fear and foolishness. "Stay," he said simply. "Please." Eleanor looked around at the gathered household staff, at Mrs. Holloway's hopeful expression, at young Alice wiping tears from her own eyes near the entrance, at the gray towers of the manor that had, despite everything, slowly become something she thought of as home. She looked finally back at Sebastian, at the man who had spent years hiding behind careful walls of control and distance, now standing exposed and vulnerable in front of everyone who served him, choosing honesty over pride, choosing her over the safety of emotional distance. "I will stay," she said quietly, "but we build this properly, Sebastian. No more locked doors, whether they hold grief or fear or anything else. We face what comes together, honestly, from this point forward." "Together," he agreed, and for the first time since she had known him, she watched something that might genuinely be called a smile begin to form at the corners of his mouth, small and uncertain, but real. In the weeks that followed, the truth of Henry Colton's deception became widely known throughout the county, thoroughly dismantling the cruel rumors that had briefly threatened to destroy Eleanor's reputation. The steward faced the full consequences of his theft, while the story of Eleanor's quiet sacrifice, her decision to direct her own dowry toward saving her family rather than securing her personal comfort, spread instead, transforming public perception of the woman once dismissed, as the forgotten sister, into genuine admiration for her integrity and strength. Camille, faced with the public unraveling of her role in spreading unfounded gossip, found herself facing consequences of her own, a diminished standing in social circles that had once eagerly welcomed her, and a quiet, humbling realization that the sister she had spent years overshadowing possessed a depth of character she had never bothered to recognize. Sebastian, true to his word, began the slow, careful work of rebuilding trust through consistent action rather than empty promises. He opened the nursery door at last, not alone, but with Eleanor beside him, and together they transformed the room that had held only grief for so many years into something new, a quiet sitting room filled with light, a space no longer defined by loss but by the possibility of a future neither of them had dared to imagine when their marriage had first begun, as nothing more than a practical arrangement between two strangers. He began joining her each evening for dinner in the main hall, their conversations gradually deepening beyond household matters into genuine curiosity about each other's thoughts, hopes, and quiet dreams. He learned to voice his fears rather than burying them behind cold composure, and Eleanor, in turn, learned to trust that her worth in his eyes did not depend on her usefulness, but on the simple, steady truth of who she was. Months later, standing together in the gardens she had spent so much careful effort restoring, now blooming with the particular beauty of late summer, Sebastian took her hand and spoke words that carried none of the cold, practical efficiency of their first meeting. "I did not know, that day in your family's drawing room, that the woman standing quietly in the doorway would become the most important person in my life," he said. "I looked at you and saw only a solution to an immediate problem. I did not yet understand that I was looking at someone who would teach me how to feel again, how to trust again, how to hope again." Eleanor smiled, the easy, genuine smile of a woman who had finally, after a lifetime of being overlooked, found a place where she was truly seen and truly valued, not for what she could provide, but simply for who she was. "You said I would do," she reminded him gently, though I do not believe either of us understood, in that moment, exactly what that would come to mean. "I was wrong to say it so plainly," Sebastian admitted, "though I have come to understand it differently now. You did not simply do, Eleanor. You transformed everything. This house, this family, and the man who nearly let his own fear cost him the greatest gift he was ever given." Eleanor rested her head against his shoulder as the evening light settled golden across the gardens, and thought of the forgotten sister she had once been, the daughter overlooked in favor of brighter, more celebrated beauty, the woman who had believed, for so many years, that her worth was measured only by her usefulness to others. She understood now, standing in the quiet peace of a home she had helped rebuild from cold silence into genuine warmth, that true worth was never something that needed to be granted by others. It was something carried within, revealed through patience, integrity, and the quiet courage to remain honest, even when the world around her offered every reason to become bitter or small. She had been chosen, finally and completely, not out of necessity, but out of genuine love, earned slowly and honestly through the steady accumulation of trust neither of them had believed themselves capable of building. And for a woman who had spent so long being the one no one wanted, that quiet, hard-won love felt like more than enough.